Candyman will get me.
There's some fear of yours in this film.
People said, this is the scariest movie I've ever seen. I can't sit through it.
Candyman. Candyman is born of extreme racism.
In a horror movie, the hero is really the villain.
Be my victim.
This wonderfully noble black villain.
His spirit was so strong that he refused to die.
An urban legend is a story that everybody feels that they've heard it from somebody who was just 1 degree removed from the source of the story.
My friend heard it on the radio. It's true.
These stories have actually no basis in fact, yet people believe them with a passionate intensity. They obviously represent some kind of fundamental and profound fear that people have about modern urban societies.
Urban legend is sort of like fairy tales for the city. They play on our most basic fears.
I read a book by Jan Brunvold called The Vanishing Hitchhiker. Brunvold, I think, was the first person to collect these stories together and coin the term urban legend.
I think the most powerful ones tend to be the horrific ones. I remember being told the variation on the hook-handed man who escapes from the asylum. I was the little Boy Scout who, around the campfire, was called upon to tell the ghost story. That's what I did. I wasn't very good at putting up tents, and I couldn't cook bacon, but I could tell, a scary story.
Bernard based the screenplay for Candyman on a story from the Books of Blood collection by Clive Barker. It was called The Forbidden. The core of the story was about the journey into this crypt lair where this urban legend lived. The woman who was exploring it met a very grim ending.
It's set in Liverpool, it's set in my hometown, which is a very tough northern working class city in England. It was and remains a very violent city. In the 60s, horror fiction started to look at an urban environment as being the place that you could really scare people. The Gothic context, the romantic castle, was not going to be as scary for most audience members as the streets of a darkened city. My grandmother warned me, I remember, of going into public toilets because there were men who went around the public toilets and cut the genitals off little boys. This was difficult for a 4-year-old to take in. It terrified the wits out of me. That is actually the origin of the Candyman. I was writing about the experience of horror. This was about why we write these tales, why we hear these tales. This story was about itself.
Your death would be a tale to frighten children, to make lovers cling closer in their rapture.
It's a beautifully written short story. I think it's one of Clive's best.
Bernard had read the story in the Books of Blood and approached Clive and had come into contact with Propaganda Films, which was the production company that I was allied with then. They had agreed to hire him to write a feature-length adaptation.
Prior to Candyman, I made a film called Paper House,
which is an extraordinary film that really was able to conjure up a sense of deep dread.
I think Bernard did a masterstroke when he transposed it to America, inner city Chicago.
Chicago seemed like a very just a dynamic place, and so I went there to do some research and looking for a setting for the film, and that was how I came across the real housing project at Cabrini Green.
In finding the contemporary equivalent of the haunted house, he chose to go into the projects.
People are frightened of the wrong part of town.
What's with the arsenal, Bernadette? We're only going 8 blocks. I grew up in Chicago. I knew about Cabrini Green. You didn't even drive by Cabrini Green.
I won't even drive past there. Heard a kid got shot there the other day.
The whole nature of the murders that happened in Cabrini Green coming through the bathroom cabinet was based on some real murders that happened. In American society, the class barriers were drawn along racial lines, especially in a place like Chicago.
The average white person does not ever have to go to Cabrini Green. The average white person doesn't ever have to go to South Central. You don't have to know about us. We have to know about you.
The fear that somehow there are parts of the city you can't venture into and all that is largely irrational, but it's very real and it's very palpable.
He tapped into something by making that Candyman's current home.
I hear you looking for Candyman, bitch.
There are 2 big blots in American history. The first one is the massacre of the Aboriginal Americans, and the second was slavery. Essentially, those two events aren't tangential to American history, they are the real history of America.
My grandparents would talk about lynchings and being chased by the phantoms of the KKK.
In a horror film, you can address things like that, which if you addressed them in a straight drama, all the corporate naysayers go, "Oh no, we don't say that." In a horror film, it's like, oh, it's just some garbage, some bloody nonsense for the kids.
In the original story, the Candyman is all kinds of colors. Bernard had to argue strongly for being allowed to make the Candyman black. There had been black horror movies before Candyman. They had tend to be very campy. I think one of the things that Bernard did is really make this character have some real nobility.
Be my victim.
The whole point about the Candyman is that he's a representative of people who are oppressed. But he himself is very sophisticated, very educated, and very elegant. He's a romantic figure. I think that gave him a kind of tragic, wounded hero quality.
The idea of a monster who is aware of his tragic dimension, his pain, his alienation, is something that comes along with Gothic fiction.
Candyman, he's just a story. You know, like Dracula or Frankenstein.
The only good monster is a tragic monster. I mean, Frankenstein was a tragic monster, and Dracula is a tragic monster.
The strongest image I had was Phantom of the Opera. There is that alienation that even though Dracula and the Phantom have this superiority, they're both lonely, fragile characters at their core. And I thought Candyman could belong to that company as well.
He's not looking for revenge. That's what makes him different from a lot of horror villains. He's looking for love.
Candyman plays on the fears of the big black male that can carry off the white woman.
The situation historically in America, and also specifically in American cinema, is that of the black male being a very large threat to the single white female. We were using a very loaded imagery, but we were not trying to exploit the same kinds of stereotype views.
Surrender to me now.
You have this black monster villain seducing this white woman, and she is absolutely compliant in all of that. The academics that she's surrounded by, her husband, who's a dullard, are really not deserving of her affections. The Candyman, in a bizarre way, is.
Virginia was discovered by David Lynch in Dune. She was known for being beautiful, for being sexy, for being sultry.
I was never worried about being typecast. I was only one role away from being out of that, but I was having trouble getting that role.
This was a chance for her to really carry a movie and play a very serious character with a serious intellect.
Can I talk to your friend?
Bernard can get actors to do anything. I'm gonna be terrified, I'm gonna be abused, I'm gonna be covered with bees, I'm gonna be on fire, Oh, yeah, I'd like to do that.
Her personality and her physical aura gives the movie as much of its sense of mystery as Tony does.
But I don't scare too easy either, Jake.
I get a call from my manager saying that Bernard Rose had seen me in something, and he insists that I'm the guy for this new movie.
He's an Othello, he's a Shakespearean actor, and is able to command a stage.
As you can see from the drawings, I was really looking for somebody pretty much like Tony. He obviously has a huge physical presence.
Tony's very dignified and very beautiful and very tall. He does have an air of aristocracy about him.
He has a wonderful, big, rich voice.
He has a voice that is tremendously deep, resonant, and full of sorrow.
I immediately got to my art sketch pad and started doing impressions of textures, cloths, brushes, paint swabs. Virginia and I went to waltzing classes together, took fencing classes together. We're both committed to this story.
Candyman's costume is very effective. The idea was that he would be in a long coat like a man in that era would wear on his way to the opera.
Lenny Pollock, our costume designer, came up with that concept of the long coat with the fur trim, and Bernard, the minute he saw it, he said, that's it.
The coat gave me a sense of royalty. The hook, we had many discussions about what we're going to do, whether we're going to pull the arm up or we're going to strap on, and at the end of the day, we did a little bit of both. If you ever see Candyman in full frame, his arm's not the same length.
Really, it's just Tony. He's not wearing any makeup. That's what Tony looks like. The Cabrini Green exteriors were shot in Cabrini Green and stuff in the stairwells, but it was not a safe place. It was a place that the police did not have control over.
There were like 4 to 5 different warring factions of gangs surrounding the place.
There were some challenges that involved dealing with the local gangs, making sure that they were on our side.
Well, they had to pay off people.
Bernard just hired the gang.
We did make a point of picking up local kids, both because it'd be good to give them a job and give them some money, and also because it helped our credibility.
You could really see that they were little kids. They were just teenagers.
We all on drugs, right?
We do build a mythology of what we expect in the projects. And there were, we ran into just a lot of families.
It went very smoothly, and then at the end of our last day there, somebody from a rooftop put a bullet into the camera truck. And it just came through the roof of the camera truck and lodged in the floor. We moved as quietly and as efficiently as we could, and we left. But until we had all the trucks out of there, I was sweating.
Bernard's a bit mad,
And Bernard's, wacky.
He is a very original soul.
He'd be twisting his hair and kind of talking like this.
running around twirling his hair going, more blood, more blood, more blood.
Madness.
How does somebody react when they see the monster? Are they going to be like Fay Ray and go, It's very annoying to watch people screaming. And it's a fucking horrible noise, too.
I came for you.
How do you really respond to an alien creature?
Do I know you?
Bernard came up with the idea that for any scenes where Virginia was going to come into contact with the Candyman, he decided that it was best to actually hypnotize her.
When she saw him, she would be hypnotized, like as if in a trance, as if no longer really in the real world.
We went to a hypnotist, Bernard and I.
He indeed put her in a trance. And while she was in the trance, he gave me a key word. If I would say the word to her, she would slip back into the trance. 2 days later, I just tried it to see if it would work, and lo and behold, it did. She went.
Bernard, I think, didn't know whether I was just getting really into character or whether he'd really been able to do it. And I think he finally realized when he had to, snap me out of it, because I was just sort of sitting there.
I went on set and Bernard said everybody has to be completely silent and everybody has to move down to that end of the set. Everybody, that means you, Mr. Producer. Bernard was making gestures in the air in front of Virginia.
Once he would start hypnotizing me, I was not very aware of my surroundings. I really couldn't see the crew. I could see the lights, and all the lights became very, very blurry because my pupils would be dilated. And pretty much the only thing I could hear was Bernard.
So in those scenes, if you look at her eyes don't blink and they go completely red. She's in a trance. There was, I think, one day where she didn't really remember the entire day of shooting. And I think that pissed her off a little bit, so she didn't want to do it after that.
Keep away from me! By the end of it, I was like, you know what? I can't do it anymore, Bernard. Don't come near me with that look on your face, because I'm not going under.
As the producer who was watching the clock, do I really believe that Virginia would not have been capable of the same performance simply being told to act hypnotized? I can't say.
It all created a highly charged environment that worked anyway. Whether you believed or not really wasn't the point. It was whether Virginia and Bernard believed, and whether when she looked at me, she believed.
Sweets to the sweet.
I use a quote from Hamlet in the story Sweets to the Sweet. In England, we have golden syrup. The makers of this syrup put on their can a partially rotted corpse of a lion with bees flying around it. The quote that's at the bottom is, "From the strong shall come sweetness." I like the idea that there be something perversely sweet about the monstrous. Bernard is insisting that we have real bees on set.
The bees were organized by a very clever man called Norman Gary, who we'd first seen actually on the Johnny Carson show, performing covered in bees. He played the clarinet.
I really felt that he knew them by name. I mean, he loved these creatures.
He built an apiary on the roof of the studio, and they were all living up there and having a little hive and everything. Bees don't really have much sting until they're like 24 hours old. So he would hatch them. They would look like full-grown bees, but they'd only be 12 hours old, so they couldn't really sting you.
Working with bees is never easy because they don't follow directions.
When we had to do the bee sequences, we had to tent in the set so that they wouldn't all escape. And of course, it's quite difficult to work with bees indoors in artificial lighting because their instinct, when there's like film lights around, is to fly straight for the lights, which of course is rather bad news for them because then their wings burn off. They're angry now, and so they go looking to take some vengeance. And if you happen to not have your pant legs taped down, they crawl up your pant legs and come up and sting you on the bollocks.
On some of our bee days, we actually had a representative of the ASPCA on the set, which didn't make everybody very happy because you knew that a couple of bees were going to inadvertently get smacked or stepped on.
Virginia, of course, we discovered in pre-production, was hyperallergic to bee venom.
When we had any scenes with bees, there would be an ambulance on the soundstage and paramedics behind the camera, and I was like, it's a vote of confidence there. I had to meet with the bee expert. Through my education of bees, I learned not to be afraid of them.
Norman had developed this queen bee pheromone, which you could put on a person or an object, and the worker and drone bees would be attracted to it as if you were the queen, and so they would protect you rather than sting you.
What he does is he puts little tiny dots of pheromones like wherever the bees are to go. Then he stands up above you with basically a jar full of bees and kind of goes like this, and they go and they like fall on you, and that's the only moment where you go bees, bees. Then they start to spread out and they start to move around, and that part's okay because they feel like little tiny Q-tips all over your skin.
The moment when Candyman first opens his mouth and the bees are there, I knew that that was something cinematically that just hadn't been done before, so I wanted to be able to do it.
Literally, all he did was put a little mouth guard in Tony's mouth so that he couldn't swallow them.
And then he would say, okay, there's no better way to do this but to scoop it in your mouth. And then I'd have to close, and then I'd wait for Bernard to do his thing with Virginia.
He has the bees in his mouth. He was stung 3 or 4 times, even though they were supposed to be young. I guess some of them didn't like being in Tony's mouth.
And then at the end of it, Norman and his assistants would have basically those ready vacs and scooping them up.
Norman was very humane with the bees, and he developed this little suction thing that he would suck them back into a little box and take them back up to their dressing room on the roof.
Candyman.
One of the things that I really always wanted to do was not have the score behave in the way that it normally does in a horror movie. Normally the score in a horror movie tells you when you're supposed to be scared, which to me is the same thing as telling me I'm not going to be scared. I'm a huge fan of Philip Glass's music. It was before the film. I thought the score for Mishima was one of the best scores I'd ever heard, and I really loved Kinda Scotsy as well. I thought, wow, if only we could get Philip Glass. And Alan Poole went, well, I know him. I'll call him up. I went, I'll call him up.
Well, I approached Phil, and he was like, you want me to do a horror movie?
I showed him a very early assembly. Phil really liked it.
Bernard was very articulate about all the various metaphorical angles that he was working and why the rhythms of the film would work perfectly with the rhythms of Phil's music, and Phil was sold.
I said, I really would like to do the movie with very limited orchestration, and in fact it's written just for piano, organ and voice.
A couple months after the film was released, I got a phone call from Phil, and he was like, Helen, you made me do a horror movie. We started submitting to the MPAA, and they kept coming back with an NC-17 rating. They don't like spurting blood. It wasn't the beads, it wasn't the shot cuts. It turned out it was just a question of what bodily fluid was squirting in what direction.
I remember on the first night of Candyman, the guys from propaganda hired a limo, and we all just went around from cinema to cinema just to see how it was playing. It was playing the same way wherever we went. People were yelling at the screen.
There were huge screams. People were running up the aisle because they couldn't take it anymore.
Stop! Stop! Audiences had a blast. Audiences were terrified out of their seats.
Scared of something.
They wanted something serious. They wanted to be scared.
Either you hated this film or you thought it was a masterpiece.
At the time when we were Finishing the film was a time of tremendous racial tension in Los Angeles. We actually had a test screening that was scheduled to happen the day that the Rodney King riots broke out.
Because the Rodney King thing was going on while we were finishing up on the picture, there was an anxiety that it was going to seem racist.
I don't think it's that surprising that there would be some level of controversy. It's a black monster terrorizing a white woman.
I knew you'd come.
Inner city urban audiences who, from the get-go, liked the movie. Rather than regarding it as any kind of detriment, it was helping the movie play.
Candyman.
The movie was successful enough and seemed to have entered the national consciousness to enough of a degree that there was talk that we should do a sequel.
They were obliged contractually to have me write a draft, so I did write a sequel, but they rejected it.
He was driven crazy by people demanding that, oh, well, we need a scene that's like this, or a scene that's like that. What they wanted was Candyman 1 with the names changed.
So Bill Condon came in to direct Candyman 2, Farewell to the Flesh.
Bill Condon came on board, I thought, made a very good movie, very elegantly done and well performed.
Bill went on after Candyman 2 to write and direct Gods and Monsters, for which he won an Oscar.
The third movie is Day of the Dead. Candyman comes to LA.
When I went to Cabrini Green in '91, it was a pretty awful place for people who had the misfortune to be living there. Now, it is mostly demolished. I wouldn't take credit for getting Cabrini Green knocked down, but the facts are we made that film in Cabrini Green, and now they're knocking it down.
Today, people who are from Chicago will go, hey man, yeah, I got out of Cabrini Green. I mean, they really embrace the movie because it resonates with some sort of racial history.
Tony Todd will tell you if he walks down the street, black members of the audience will yell, yo, Candyman. They love the idea that they got their own monster here.
It's a blessing and a curse, you know? It's great to make a movie that really rattles people, but at the same time, as actors, we spend a lot of time trying to distance ourselves from that particular image.
The world is so scary that you almost need a Candyman to kind of release a general feeling of terror that we all have every day.
I think Candyman has become a horror villain. He's been added to the pantheon. He's up there now, which is an extraordinary thing.
Candyman.
Candyman.
Candyman. Candyman.
Candyman. Ready? I, Tony Todd, sweets to the sweet. Candyman. 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 Candyman.
Good call. That's great.